In the fog-shrouded fishing village of Stonington, Maine, lobster boats returned with the rhythm of the tide, and everyone knew their neighbor's catch. In 2005, a 21-year-old marine biology student vanished from the rocky shoreline, driven by her passion to protect Maine's coastal ecosystem. For 3 days, her body lay hidden by the trusted fisherman who'd taught her to read tide charts, who'd shared his knowledge of the sea, who'd lit candles at her memorial. 18 years later, a discarded coffee cup in Portland and genetic genealogy analysis revealed that the trusted waterman was the monster who'd stolen her future. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on the latest cases. The summer of 2005 arrived in Stonington with the kind of beauty that made postcards seem inadequate. This fishing village, perched on Deer Isle in Hancock County, Maine, was home to fewer than 1,100 year-round residents, though that number swelled slightly in summer when tourists came to photograph the working waterfront and eat lobster rolls at Fisherman's Friend restaurant. The village was defined by its relationship with the sea. Colorful lobster buoys decorated every porch, the smell of salt and bait hung permanently in the air, and the rhythm of daily life moved with the tides. Stonington's harbor was lined with weathered wooden docks where dozens of lobster boats rocked gently in their slips. The village had been a working fishing community for over 2 centuries, and many families could trace their presence there back 5 or 6 generations. Everyone knew everyone else, not just by name but by boat, by territory, by reputation. In a place this small, privacy was a luxury few possessed, and secrets were currency that rarely stayed hidden for long. It was into this tight-knit world that Emma Catherine Whitmore had arrived 3 years earlier as a freshman at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, just 40 miles north. Emma, who went by Katie to everyone who knew her, had grown up in suburban Portland, the daughter of 2 high school teachers who'd instilled in her a love of learning and the outdoors. Her childhood summers had been spent at her grandparents' cottage on Sebago Lake, where she developed a fascination with aquatic life that eventually crystallized into a clear academic path: marine biology with a focus on kelp forest ecosystems and coastal conservation. College of the Atlantic, with its progressive human ecology curriculum and direct access to Frenchman Bay, had been Katie's dream school. She'd thrown herself into her studies with the kind of intensity that made professors take notice. By her junior year in 2005, she was working on an independent study project examining the impact of warming ocean temperatures on kelp populations along the down-east Maine coast. The research required frequent trips to various coastal sites, and Katie had developed relationships with several local fishermen who helped her access remote locations and shared their observations of changing marine conditions. One of those fishermen was Tom Whitaker, a 48-year-old lobsterman who'd worked Stonington's waters for 3 decades. Tom was something of a fixture in the village. His boat, the Mary Catherine, named for his late mother, was always one of the first out in the morning and one of the last back in the evening. He lived alone in a small Cape Cod-style house on the edge of town, having never married, though locals remembered a girlfriend who'd left for Boston years ago and never returned. Tom was known as reliable, knowledgeable, and quiet, the kind of man who could read weather in the clouds and predict lobster movements by water temperature. He wasn't particularly social, but in a village full of taciturn Yankees, that hardly made him stand out. Katie had met Tom during her sophomore year when she'd approached several Stonington lobstermen seeking help for a class project on traditional ecological knowledge. Most had been polite but dismissive of the college kid asking questions about their work. Tom, however, had surprised her by agreeing to an interview and then offering to take her out on his boat to see the kelp beds firsthand. Over the following year, an unlikely mentorship had developed. Tom taught Katie to read tide charts, explained the historical changes he'd observed in fish populations, and even helped her set up monitoring stations at several sites along the coast. To Katie's friends and family, Tom seemed like a stroke of good fortune, a local expert willing to help an eager student. Her parents had met him once when they visited Bar Harbor, and he'd been courteous and knowledgeable, if a bit reserved. Katie's research advisor at College of the Atlantic approved of the collaboration, seeing it as a valuable example of community-engaged science. No one saw any reason for concern. Tom was old enough to be Katie's father, showed no signs of inappropriate interest, and in a small village where everyone watched everyone else, any impropriety would have been noticed immediately. On July 15, 2005, Katie drove her aging Honda Civic from Bar Harbor to Stonington, a journey of about an hour and a half along winding coastal road. She'd arranged to meet Tom at 6 a.m. to go out on his boat and check the kelp monitoring stations she'd established at 3 sites around Crotch Island and nearby waters. It was a Friday, and Katie had planned to spend the weekend at her parents' house in Portland after the field work was done. Tom's boat was already idling at the dock when Katie arrived, her backpack stuffed with data sheets, sample bags, and the waterproof camera she used to document the kelp bed. Several other lobstermen were preparing their boats nearby, and multiple people later remembered seeing Katie climb aboard the Mary Catherine, smiling and chatting with Tom as he cast off the mooring lines. The morning was clear and calm, the kind of perfect July day that reminded people why they endured Maine's brutal winters. The boat headed out into Jericho Bay, and for the next several hours, Katie and Tom followed their established routine. They visited monitoring sites, with Katie diving in her wetsuit to photograph and measure kelp specimens while Tom managed the boat. Other lobstermen working the area saw the Mary Catherine at various points throughout the morning, exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what Katie had done dozens of times before. Around 1 p.m., Tom radioed the harbor master that he was heading back in, earlier than he'd originally planned. When asked if everything was okay, Tom said Katie wasn't feeling well, possibly seasick or overheated, and wanted to get back to shore. The harbor master thought nothing of it. Even experienced boaters could have off days on the water. But Katie never made it back to Bar Harbor. She never arrived at her parents' house in Portland that evening. And when her mother, Jennifer Whitmore, called Katie's cell phone repeatedly that night and got no answer, worry quickly turned to panic. By Saturday morning, Jennifer had driven to Bar Harbor and found Katie's car still parked in the College of the Atlantic lot. The college's weekend security officer helped Jennifer access Katie's dorm room, where everything appeared normal: clothes in the closet, laptop on the desk, no signs of hasty packing or distress. Jennifer's next call was to the Hancock County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing. The sheriff's deputy who took the report immediately noted that Katie had last been seen with Tom Whitaker on his lobster boat. By Saturday afternoon, 2 deputies drove to Stonington and knocked on Tom's door. He answered readily, appearing concerned when told that Katie was missing. Tom's statement was straightforward and consistent. Yes, Katie had been on his boat Friday morning for her research work. They'd visited the monitoring sites as planned. Around noon, Katie had started complaining of nausea and dizziness, possibly heat exhaustion, Tom thought, as it had been quite warm on the water with no breeze. He'd offered to take her back to shore immediately, but Katie had insisted on finishing at least 2 of the 3 sites. By 1 p.m., she was feeling worse, so Tom had headed back to Stonington. He'd docked around 1:30, and Katie had said she was going to sit in her car with the air conditioning on for a while before driving back to Bar Harbor. Tom had offered to take her to the health center, but she'd declined, saying she'd be fine once she cooled off. That was the last time he'd seen her. He'd assumed she'd driven home. The deputies asked if they could search Tom's boat. He agreed without hesitation. They found Katie's research equipment, data sheets, sample bags, the waterproof camera, neatly stowed in a storage compartment. Tom explained that Katie had left them there, saying she'd pick them up the next time she came to Stonington. Everything in the boat appeared normal, no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing suspicious. But Katie was still missing. The Hancock County Sheriff's Office launched a search operation that quickly expanded to include Maine State Police, the Coast Guard, and dozens of volunteers. The working theory was that Katie, feeling ill, had attempted to drive home but had somehow become incapacitated. Search teams combed the roads between Stonington and Bar Harbor, checked every turnoff and rest area, searched the woods along Route 15 and Route 3. On Sunday morning, a Coast Guard helicopter spotted something in the water off the western shore of Crotch Island, about 2 miles from Stonington Harbor. A Coast Guard boat was dispatched, and crew members pulled Katie Whitmore's body from the cold Atlantic waters. She was still wearing her wetsuit. The Coast Guard officers could see immediately that this was not a simple drowning. Dr. Margaret Chern, the state medical examiner who performed the autopsy in Augusta, determined that Katie had died from manual strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. She had defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. Tissue collected from beneath her fingernails contained DNA that wasn't hers. The condition of the body suggested she'd been in the water for approximately 48 to 60 hours, which aligned with the timeline of her disappearance on Friday afternoon. Ocean currents and tidal patterns indicated the body had likely entered the water somewhere in Jericho Bay, not far from where Tom's boat had been working that day. The investigation immediately focused on Tom Whitaker. He'd been the last person to see Katie alive. He'd been alone with her on his boat for hours. His story about Katie feeling ill and sitting in her car had no witnesses to corroborate it. And now Katie's body showed clear evidence of homicide. Maine State Police detectives interviewed Tom again, this time at the Hancock County Sheriff's Office in Ellsworth. Tom maintained his story but added details. Yes, he'd been concerned about Katie on Friday. She'd been quieter than usual on the boat, seemed distracted. When she'd said she wasn't feeling well, he'd immediately turned the boat around. He'd helped her onto the dock, she'd been a bit unsteady, and walked her to her car. She'd thanked him and said she'd be fine. He'd watched her get into the car and turn on the engine. Then he'd gone to get lunch at Fisherman's Friend restaurant before heading home. Detectives checked the restaurant. The owner confirmed Tom had been there around 2 p.m. on Friday, his usual time for a late lunch. He'd seemed normal, had eaten his regular fried haddock sandwich, chatted briefly about the weather with another fisherman. He'd paid in cash and left after about 30 minutes. But the timeline was suspicious. If Katie had died between Friday afternoon and early Saturday morning, and if her body had been found miles from shore, how had it gotten there? Katie's car was still in the College of the Atlantic parking lot, meaning she'd never driven away from the area. The medical evidence showed she'd died on land, the drowning was post-mortem, she'd been dead before entering the water. Maine State Police requested permission to search Tom's house and property. Tom again agreed, signed the consent forms, even helped the search team access his shed and outbuildings. They found nothing obviously incriminating, no blood evidence, no signs of struggle, no items belonging to Katie except for some research papers she'd given Tom months earlier about kelp populations. They did collect biological samples from Tom for DNA comparison. In 2005, DNA technology was advancing rapidly, but it still required relatively good samples and took time to process. The tissue from beneath Katie's fingernails was sent to the Maine State Police Crime Laboratory in Augusta for analysis. The detectives also interviewed everyone who'd been at Stonington Harbor on Friday. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing Katie board Tom's boat that morning. One lobsterman remembered seeing the Mary Catherine heading back to harbor around 1:30, which matched Tom's story. But no one remembered seeing Katie on the dock after the boat came in. No one had seen her sitting in her car. As the investigation intensified, Tom hired a lawyer, a criminal defense attorney from Bangor named Robert Haskell. Haskell advised Tom to stop speaking with police without legal counsel present. The flow of information stopped, and the investigation hit its first serious obstacle. Weeks turned into months. The DNA results came back from the crime lab. The profile extracted from beneath Katie's fingernails was male and didn't match Katie or any of her known associates. It was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database, but there was no hit. The person whose DNA it was had never been arrested or otherwise had their DNA collected for law enforcement purposes. Critically, detectives wanted to compare this DNA profile to Tom Whitaker's sample. But there was a problem. Tom had voluntarily provided a cheek swab during the early investigation, but the sample had been improperly stored at the county sheriff's office. When it was finally sent to the crime lab for comparison analysis, the DNA had degraded to the point of being unusable. The lab reported that they couldn't get a clean enough profile from Tom's sample to make a reliable comparison with the crime scene DNA. Detectives asked Tom, through his lawyer, to provide another sample. Tom, now represented by counsel and increasingly aware that he was the primary suspect, refused. And without probable cause for an arrest, police couldn't compel him to provide DNA. The investigation continued down other avenues. Detectives looked at Katie's life for any other possible suspect. Had she had a boyfriend? Any romantic entanglements that might have turned dangerous? They interviewed her friends at College of the Atlantic, her professors, her classmates. Everyone described Katie as focused, driven, friendly but not particularly social in a romantic sense. She dated casually as a freshman but had been single for over a year, concentrating on her research. No one could think of anyone who might have wanted to harm her. They investigated other lobstermen who'd been on the water that day. Could someone else have encountered Katie? Had there been any conflicts? But every other fisherman had alibis, wives or crew members who could account for their time, and none of them had any apparent connection to Katie. By early 2006, the investigation had effectively stalled. The Hancock County District Attorney's Office believed Tom Whitaker was responsible. The circumstantial evidence pointed strongly in his direction, but without physical evidence directly tying him to the murder, without the DNA comparison, and with no witnesses to the actual killing, they didn't believe they could prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Maine, like most states, has no statute of limitations on murder, so the case remained open, but active investigation tapered off as detectives were pulled to new cases. For Jennifer and David Whitmore, Katie's parents, the lack of resolution was torturous. They'd attended every court hearing, every meeting with investigators. They'd created a scholarship in Katie's name at College of the Atlantic for marine biology students. But knowing that the person who'd likely killed their daughter was walking free, still living in Stonington, still taking his boat out every morning, was a special kind of hell. The first year was consumed by raw grief. Jennifer couldn't enter Katie's old bedroom without breaking down. David threw himself into his teaching, working 12-hour days to avoid coming home to the silence. They attended a support group for families of homicide victims, where they met other parents trapped in the same nightmare of unsolved cases and inadequate answers. By the second year, grief had hardened into a kind of bitter endurance. They tried to resume some version of normal life, but Katie's absence was a void that nothing could fill. Holidays were the worst. Katie's birthday in November. Christmas, when they'd saved her stocking but couldn't bear to hang it. The anniversary of her death each July, when the beautiful summer weather felt like an insult. Jennifer became an advocate for cold case reform, writing letters to state legislators, pushing for better funding for the Maine State Police Crime Lab, advocating for laws that would make it easier to compel suspects to provide DNA samples. David was quieter in his grief, but no less devastated. He'd aged visibly, his hair turning gray, his face lined with permanent exhaustion. They stayed in touch with the detective assigned to Katie's case, a Maine state trooper named Sarah Morrison, who joined the investigation in late 2005. Morrison was sympathetic but realistic. "I believe Tom Whitaker killed your daughter," Morrison told them in a 2007 meeting. "But belief isn't enough. I need evidence that will convince 12 jurors. And right now, I don't have it." In Stonington, Tom Whitaker continued his life with remarkable normalcy. He still took the Mary Catherine out every morning. He still ate lunch at Fisherman's Friend. He attended the occasional community event, the Stonington lobster boat races, the 4th of July parade. Some villagers ostracized him, believing the whispers that he'd gotten away with murder. Others defended him, pointing out that he'd never been charged, that there was no proof, that in America you're innocent until proven guilty. The truth was that in a village of 1,100 people, completely shunning someone was nearly impossible. Tom's boat still needed fuel from the same dock as everyone else's. He still sold his lobsters to the same buyers. He still shopped at the same small grocery store. A cold civility developed. People nodded but didn't engage in conversation, they did business but nothing more. If Tom felt the weight of suspicion, he never showed it publicly. He kept to himself even more than before, which in Stonington's culture of taciturn self-reliance wasn't particularly remarkable. He didn't date, didn't socialize, just worked and went home. To outsiders, he might have seemed like a lonely figure. To those who suspected him of murder, he seemed like a coward hiding behind the legal system's requirement for proof. Years passed. The case grew colder. Detective Morrison retired in 2013, and Katie's file was passed to other investigators who would periodically review it but had no new leads to pursue. The DNA profile from beneath Katie's fingernails remained in Cody's, automatically compared against new entries, but year after year, there were no hit. By 2015, Katie Whitmore's case was a decade old. Jennifer and David were in their 60s now, still living in Portland, still thinking about their daughter every day. They'd followed news stories about other families whose cold cases had been solved through advances in DNA technology, and they held on to a thread of hope that someday, somehow, science might give them the answer they desperately needed. That year, the Maine legislature approved funding for the state's first unsolved homicide unit, a specialized team within the Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit dedicated exclusively to cold cases. The unit consisted of 2 detectives, 1 forensic scientist, and a victim advocate, working in coordination with an assistant attorney general from the state prosecutor's office. The unit's mission was to apply fresh eyes and new forensic techniques to cases that had gone cold, prioritizing those where advances in DNA technology might make a difference. Katie Whitmore's case was one of the first files pulled for review. The new lead detective, James Corrigan, had 20 years of experience and a reputation for meticulous casework. When he opened Katie's file and read through the investigation reports, one thing jumped out immediately. The degraded DNA sample from Tom Whitaker had never been recollected or properly compared to the crime scene evidence. Corrigan knew that DNA technology had advanced significantly since 2005. Modern techniques could extract usable profiles from smaller, more degraded samples. More importantly, the forensic analysis methods had become more sophisticated. He sent Katie's case file to the crime lab with a specific request. Could they re-examine all the biological evidence using current technology? The crime lab's answer was yes. They still had the preserved tissue samples from beneath Katie's fingernails, stored in optimal conditions for 18 years. Using modern DNA extraction and amplification techniques, they could generate a more complete profile than had been possible in 2005. But they still needed a comparison sample from Tom Whitaker, and he'd never provided another one after his initial sample was degraded. This is where Corrigan's experience became crucial. He knew that Maine law, like most states, allowed police to collect DNA from discarded items if those items were abandoned in public spaces. It required patience and surveillance, but it was legal and admissible in court. In the fall of 2022, Corrigan assigned 2 detectives to begin periodic surveillance of Tom Whitaker. Now 65 years old and still lobstering, Tom maintained the same routines he'd followed for decades. Every few weeks, the surveillance team would observe him for a day, documenting his movements, looking for opportunities to collect discarded DNA. On November 3, 2022, Tom drove from Stonington to Portland for a doctor's appointment, something he did twice a year for his annual physical and a follow-up. After his appointment at Maine Medical Center, he stopped at a Starbucks on Congress Street. He ordered a large coffee, sat at a table near the window reading a newspaper for about 20 minutes, then threw his cup in the trash and left. The moment Tom's truck pulled out of the parking lot, one of the surveillance detectives entered the Starbucks, retrieved the cup from the trash, and sealed it in an evidence bag. Within an hour, it was on its way to the Maine State Police Crime Laboratory. The DNA extraction took 2 weeks. When the results came back, Corrigan sat in his office at State Police Headquarters in Augusta, staring at the report. The DNA profile from the coffee cup matched the DNA profile from beneath Katie Whitmore's fingernails with 99.9999% certainty. After 17 years, they had their proof. On December 8, 2022, Maine State Police arrested Thomas Whitaker at his home in Stonington. He was charged with the murder of Emma Catherine Whitmore. The arrest warrant detailed the DNA evidence, the timeline, and the totality of circumstances that pointed to his guilt. News of the arrest spread through Stonington like wildfire. The quiet village, which had lived with this unresolved tragedy for nearly 2 decades, was stunned. At Fisherman's Friend restaurant, the place where Tom had eaten lunch the day Katie died, customers gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices about how they'd known, how they'd suspected, how he'd been among them all this time. Some expressed shock. Tom had seemed so normal, so ordinary. Others felt vindicated. They'd believed in his guilt from the beginning and now had proof. A few expressed discomfort at how easily they'd normalized his presence over the years, how they'd sold him fuel and bait and treated him with cold civility when they should have demanded answers. For Jennifer and David Whitmore, the call from Detective Corrigan brought emotions they couldn't untangle. Relief that Katie's killer had finally been identified. Rage that it had taken 17 years. Grief, fresh and raw, that surged up as if Katie had just died. And a kind of exhausted gratitude that they'd lived long enough to see this day. The interrogation of Tom Whitaker took place at Maine State Police Headquarters, with his attorney Robert Haskell present. Tom had aged considerably. His hair was white now, his face weathered from decades on the water. But when detectives placed the DNA report in front of him, explaining how his DNA had been found beneath Katie's fingernails, something in his expression shifted. Detective Corrigan began carefully. Tom, we have irrefutable evidence that you killed Katie Whitmore. Your DNA was under her fingernails, meaning she scratched you during a struggle. We know what happened. What we need to understand is why. Tom sat silently for several minutes. His attorney whispered in his ear, presumably advising him to say nothing. But Tom shook his head slightly and then began to speak. I didn't plan it, he said, his voice rough. That's what I need you to understand. I never intended for any of it to happen. Over the next 2 hours, Tom provided a detailed confession, though his attorney repeatedly objected and advised him to stop. But Tom seemed to have decided that after 17 years, the weight of silence was too much to carry. According to Tom's statement, the relationship between him and Katie had been more complicated than anyone knew. He'd developed feelings for her, romantic feelings, that he knew were inappropriate given their age difference and their professional relationship. He'd never acted on those feelings, never said anything explicit, but they'd been there, growing stronger the more time they spent together. On July 15, 2005, while they were out on the boat, Tom had finally worked up the courage to express his feelings. He'd told Katie that he cared about her as more than a research participant, that he'd come to feel things he knew he shouldn't feel. Katie's response had been kind but firm. She valued their professional relationship, appreciated everything he'd taught her, but didn't see him that way and never would. Tom said he'd accepted this at first, had apologized for making things awkward. But as they continued working that morning, something had been building in him, embarrassment, rejection, a sense of humiliation that this young woman had so easily dismissed him. By early afternoon, when they returned to the dock, his emotions had curdled into something darker. He'd asked Katie if they could talk privately before she left. She'd agreed, probably thinking he wanted to apologize again or clarify their working relationship going forward. They'd walk to a quiet spot behind the fish processing building, where there were fewer people around. That's when Tom had tried to kiss her. Katie had pushed him away, had said firmly that this wasn't okay, that she needed to leave. Tom had grabbed her arm, trying to explain himself, trying to make her understand. Katie had pulled away hard enough that she'd scratched his face and neck with her nails, defensive wounds he'd later explained away to other fishermen as being from a tangle with his lobster traps. She was going to tell people, Tom said, his voice flat now. I could see it in her face. She was horrified, disgusted. She was going to go back to the college and tell them what I'd done. I'd lose everything, my reputation, my ability to work these waters. Everyone would know. I panicked. He'd grabbed Katie again, this time more forcefully. When she'd screamed, he'd put his hand over her mouth. She'd fought him, scratching and hitting, and at some point, he claimed he didn't remember the exact sequence. He'd struck her head against the concrete corner of the building's foundation. She'd stopped fighting. Blood had been running down the side of her face. He'd panicked even more, had put his hands around her throat to stop her from screaming, and he'd squeezed until she'd stopped moving entirely. Tom had stood there, in the alley behind the fish processing building, with Katie's body at his feet, realizing what he'd done. The village had been relatively quiet. Many boats had already gone home, and it was after the lunch rush. He'd checked for a pulse and found none. Katie was dead and he'd killed her. His next actions, he said, had been driven purely by survival instinct. He'd returned to his truck, backed it to the alley, and loaded Katie's body into the bed under a tarp. He'd driven to his house, less than 2 miles away, and stored her body in his shed while he figured out what to do. That night, after dark, he'd put Katie's body back in his truck, driven to his boat, and taken it out into Jericho Bay. He'd weighted Katie's body with anchor chain and dropped it into deep water about 3 miles offshore. Except the weights hadn't held as well as he'd thought. 2 days later, currents and wave action had shifted the body, and it had surfaced near Crotch Island, where the Coast Guard had found it. I've thought about that day every single day for 17 years, Tom said. I knew I'd be caught eventually. When you started watching me this fall, following me, I knew why. Part of me was relieved. I'm tired. I'm so tired of carrying this. The confession was recorded, transcribed, and became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Tom was held without bail at Hancock County Jail in Ellsworth to await trial. In March 2023, the trial began at Hancock County Superior Court. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Catherine Walsh, presented the DNA evidence, Tom's confession, and testimony from forensic experts who walked the jury through how modern DNA technology had solved a 17-year-old murder. They called Jennifer and David Whitmore to testify about Katie's life, her dreams, her research, and the 17 years they'd waited for justice. Tom's defense attorney argued for a lesser charge of manslaughter rather than murder, claiming that Tom had acted in a moment of passion and panic rather than with premeditation. The argument gained little traction with the jury, who saw in Tom's detailed confession and his careful disposal of the body clear evidence of someone who'd known exactly what he was doing. On April 14, 2023, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on the charge of murder. Superior Court Justice Ellen Gorman sentenced Tom Whitaker to 55 years in prison without the possibility of parole. At 65 years old, Tom would almost certainly die in prison. Jennifer Whitmore gave a victim impact statement at the sentencing. She spoke for 20 minutes about Katie, her intelligence, her passion, her future stolen. She spoke about the 17 years of not knowing, of suspecting but having no proof, of watching Tom Whitaker live freely while Katie lay in a cemetery. "You took our daughter," Jennifer said, looking directly at Tom. "You took her because she rejected you, because your ego couldn't handle a young woman saying no. And then you went about your life as if nothing had happened. You ate meals, you celebrated holidays, you slept in your own bed while we lived in a nightmare. I will never forgive you. But at least now, finally, the truth is known. After the trial, the Stonington community had to reckon with its own complicated relationship to the case. Some residents felt guilty for how they'd normalized Tom's presence over the years. Others defended their response, pointing out that without proof, they couldn't have done anything differently. A few longtime friends of Tom's struggled to reconcile the man they'd known, quiet, knowledgeable, reliable, with the killer the evidence proved him to be. The case became a focal point for discussions about DNA technology and cold case investigations. The Maine Unsolved Homicide Unit held up Katie's case as proof that no case is too old, that advances in forensic science can bring resolution even decades after a crime. Detective Corrigan gave interviews emphasizing the importance of preserving evidence and never giving up on victims. College of the Atlantic held a memorial service for Katie in May 2023, bringing together her former classmates, now in their late 30s, to remember their friend and honor her passion for marine conservation. The college announced an endowed fellowship in Katie's name, funding research by students studying coastal ecosystems. Her work on kelp forests, interrupted so brutally 18 years earlier, would continue through the efforts of others. For Jennifer and David Whitmore, Tom's conviction brought a measure of peace they'd thought impossible. They could visit Katie's grave knowing that her killer would never walk free again. They could speak her name without the bitter taste of unresolved injustice. The grief didn't end, it never would, but it had transformed into something they could carry alongside the rest of their lives. In the summer of 2023, Jennifer returned to Stonington for the first time since Katie's death. She stood on the dock where Katie had boarded Tom's boat that July morning 18 years earlier. The harbor looked the same, lobster boats rocking in their slips, buoys clattering against hulls, the smell of the sea sharp and clean. But everything had changed. Katie's killer was in prison. The truth was known. And Jennifer, standing in the place where her daughter's final day had begun, felt something she'd thought she'd never feel again: the possibility of moving forward. The Stonington community also began a process of collective healing. The local historical society added Katie's story to the village's recorded history, not to sensationalize it but to acknowledge that even in tight-knit communities, tragedy can strike and secrets can hide in plain sight. They emphasized the lessons learned about the importance of speaking up, of not dismissing concerns, of understanding that monsters don't always look like monsters. Tom Whitaker was transported to Maine State Prison in Warren, where he would serve his sentence. In prison interviews conducted by a forensic psychologist for academic research on long-term concealment of homicide, Tom spoke about the psychological burden of his secret. He described how he'd constructed a mental wall between his guilt and his daily life, how he'd convinced himself that as long as he was never caught, it was as if it hadn't really happened. He spoke about the relief, strange as it sounded, of finally having the truth exposed. But he also expressed no real understanding of the magnitude of what he'd taken from Katie, from her family, from the world. Even in his confessions and interviews, he centered his own suffering, his embarrassment at rejection, his fear of being caught, his exhaustion from keeping secret. The psychologist noted in her report that Tom displayed classic narcissistic traits and a profound inability to empathize with his victim. The case also prompted legislative action in Maine. Advocates, including Jennifer Whitmore, pushed for laws making it easier to compel DNA samples from suspects in cold cases. While the state's existing laws had ultimately allowed for Tom's conviction through the discarded coffee cup, there was recognition that the 17-year delay had caused unnecessary suffering and could have been avoided with more robust evidence collection protocols. In 2024, Maine passed the Cold Case DNA Act, requiring that all biological evidence from unsolved homicides be periodically re-examined using the most current forensic technology, and establishing clearer guidelines for when and how law enforcement can seek court orders to compel DNA samples from suspects who refuse to cooperate voluntarily. Detective Corrigan, whose persistence had broken the case, received commendations from the Maine State Police and the governor's office. But in interviews, he always redirected attention away from himself and toward the Whitmore family and Katie herself. "This was never about me or the Unsolved Homicide Unit getting recognition," Corrigan said in a 2024 interview with Maine Public Radio. "This was about a brilliant young woman who was killed for rejecting someone's unwanted advances. It was about her family who never stopped fighting for answers. And it's about every other family out there still waiting for their cold case to be solved. Katie's case proves it's possible. It proves we should never give up." By 2025, the Whitmore family had established a new routine that included Katie's memory but wasn't consumed by her absence. David had retired from teaching and volunteered with a nonprofit supporting families of homicide victims. Jennifer had written a book about their experience, titled Waiting for the Tide, a family's 17-year journey to justice, which became a resource for other families navigating the cold case system. They stayed in touch with several of Katie's college friends, now middle-aged professionals with their own families. Every year on Katie's birthday, November 12th, a group would gather at a small beach near the College of the Atlantic campus and release biodegradable floating flowers into the water, honoring Katie's love of the ocean and her work to protect it. The kelp forest research that Katie had begun in 2005 had become part of a larger, ongoing study of climate change impacts on Maine's coastal ecosystems. Several marine biologists working in the Gulf of Maine cited Katie's preliminary findings in their papers, ensuring that her scientific contributions, though cut tragically short, had not been forgotten. The monitoring stations she'd established were still in use 20 years later, maintained by successive generations of College of the Atlantic students. In Stonington, the fishing village gradually moved past the shadow of the case. The harbor remained a working waterfront, lobster boats still going out with the tide. Tom Whitaker's boat, the Mary Catherine, had been sold after his conviction. Another fisherman bought it, repainted it, renamed it the Second Chance, and put it back to work. Life continued, as it always does in coastal Maine, with the rhythm of the tides and the seasons. But the case left lasting marks. Parents in Stonington and throughout Hancock County had new conversations with their daughters about trusting instincts, about the difference between mentorship and manipulation, about how predators often wear the masks of helpful neighbors and kind teachers. The stranger danger narrative gave way to a more nuanced understanding that most violence against women comes from people they know, often people they've been taught to trust. The Unsolved Homicide Unit, which had proven its worth with Katie's case and several others, received increased funding from the state legislature. By 2025, the unit had solved 12 cold cases, some dating back to the 1970s. Each success brought closure to families who'd waited decades for answers, and each success validated the investment in forensic science and dedicated investigative resources. Detective Corrigan retired in 2024, but not before training his replacement and ensuring that the protocols he developed for cold case investigation, particularly the strategies for legally obtaining DNA from uncooperative suspects, were thoroughly documented and shared with law enforcement agencies across New England. The Maine State Police Crime Laboratory also received significant upgrades. New equipment for DNA analysis, additional staff positions for forensic scientists, and improved evidence storage facilities all resulted from the attention Katie's case brought to the importance of forensic science in solving old crimes. Evidence from unsolved cases going back 50 years was systematically cataloged and re-examined using modern technique. Jennifer Whitmore became a regular speaker at criminal justice conferences, sharing her family's experience and advocating for victims' families. She emphasized that cold cases weren't just files in storage, They were families frozen in time, unable to move forward without answers. She pushed for better communication between law enforcement and families, for transparency about what resources were being devoted to cold cases, for realistic expectations without false hope. In one particularly moving speech at the National Organization for Victim Assistance Conference in 2024, Jennifer said, "For 17 years, we existed in a limbo that no parent should have to endure. We knew who killed our daughter. The whole community knew. But knowing and proving are two different things, and the law requires proof. I don't blame the detectives who worked Katie's case in 2005 and 2006. They did everything they could with the tools available at the time. What I want people to understand is that science changes, technology advances, and what was impossible yesterday becomes possible tomorrow. Every piece of evidence preserved, every file kept organized, every family kept informed. These things matter. They mattered for us, and they'll matter for the next family waiting for answers." David Whitmore was quieter in his advocacy, but no less committed. He worked with the Maine Department of Education to develop curriculum materials for high school students about the science of forensic investigation, DNA technology, and the criminal justice system. He wanted young people to understand how science could serve justice, how patience and persistence could solve seemingly impossible cases, and how every person in the system, from the evidence technician carefully storing samples to the forensic scientist running tests to the detective who never gives up, plays a crucial role. The question that haunted many people who followed Katie's case was how Tom Whitaker had managed to function normally for 17 years while carrying the secret of murder. Forensic psychologists who studied the case noted that Tom displayed what's known as compartmentalization, the ability to mentally separate the traumatic event from daily life. He'd constructed a narrative where the murder was an aberration, a terrible mistake that didn't define who he was. By avoiding thinking about it directly, by keeping busy with work, by maintaining his routines, he'd been able to function. But the psychological toll had been evident in subtle ways that became clear only in retrospect. Tom had become even more isolated after 2005, had stopped attending social events he'd occasionally participated in before, had seemed older than his years. Several fishermen recalled that Tom had started drinking more heavily in the years after Katie's death, though he'd been careful never to drink before going out on the boat. These behavioral changes were consistent with someone carrying unprocessed trauma and guilt. The case also raised questions about community responsibility. In a village as small as Stonington, where everyone knew about the suspicions surrounding Tom, what obligation did residents have to act on those suspicions? Some argued that without proof, ostracizing Tom would have been unjust. Others felt that the community had been too quick to normalize his presence, too willing to do business with someone widely believed to be a murderer because formal charges had never been filed. These debates continued in community forums, church groups, and informal conversations at the harbor. They were uncomfortable discussions, but necessary ones, about the tension between legal presumption of innocence and community safety, about when suspicion should affect social relationships, about collective responsibility for protecting vulnerable members of society. For the fishing community specifically, Katie's case prompted soul-searching about the culture of silence and self-reliance that sometimes prevented people from speaking up when something seemed wrong. Several fishermen admitted, years later, that they'd sensed something off about Tom after Katie's death. He'd been jumpier, more defensive, quicker to anger than before, but they'd said nothing because that's not what you did. You minded your own business. You didn't get involved in things that weren't your concern. Younger fishermen, particularly women entering the traditionally male-dominated lobster industry, spoke about how Katie's case made them more aware of isolation as a vulnerability. When you're out on a boat alone with someone, miles from shore, you're completely dependent on that person's good intentions. The case led to more women fishing in partnerships rather than alone, to better communication protocols about where boats were going and when they'd return, to a general heightening of awareness about personal safety on the water. College of the Atlantic also engaged in reflection about how they'd handled Katie's research arrangements. While they'd had no way of knowing that Tom Whitaker was dangerous, the case prompted new protocols about student safety during fieldwork. Students working with community partners now had required check-ins, shared their locations via GPS apps, and were encouraged to work in pairs whenever possible. These changes, while they couldn't prevent all tragedies, represented an institutional commitment to learning from what had happened to Katie. The case became required reading in forensic science programs across the country. The 17-year gap between crime and conviction, the role of DNA degradation and reanalysis, the legal strategy of obtaining DNA from a discarded item, all of these elements made it a rich case study for students learning about cold case investigation. Katie's story was featured in several true crime documentaries and podcasts, though the Whitmore family carefully controlled how her story was told, ensuring that she was portrayed as a person, not just a victim, and that her scientific work was honored alongside the investigation into her death. By the 20th anniversary of Katie's death in July 2025, Stonington had fully integrated her memory into the community's history. The village library created a small permanent exhibit about Katie's kelp forest research, with photographs of her in the field, excerpts from her research notes, and information about how her work had contributed to understanding climate change impacts on coastal Maine. It was a way of reclaiming her story from the violence that had ended her life and focusing instead on what she'd hoped to accomplish. Jennifer and David attended the exhibit opening. Standing in the library, looking at images of their daughter young and alive and full of purpose, they felt the complex mixture of emotions that would always characterize their relationship to Katie's memory: grief that she'd been taken so young, pride in what she'd accomplished in her short life, anger that Tom Whitaker had stolen her future, and gratitude that her killer had finally faced justice. As they left the library and walked down to the harbor, Jennifer paused at the dock where Katie had boarded Tom's boat for the last time. The late afternoon sun sparkled on the water. Lobster boats were returning from the day's work, their engines rumbling, gulls wheeling overhead. It was beautiful, this place that had given Katie joy and taken her life. She loved this, Jennifer said quietly to David. She loved the ocean, the community, the whole ecosystem. That's what I want people to remember. Not how she died, but how she lived. David put his arm around his wife. They will. That's why we fought so hard. So her story wouldn't end with Tom Whitaker. It ends with the research continuing, with the students who'll use that fellowship, with every cold case that gets solved because technology improved and someone didn't give up. The story of Katie Whitmore is ultimately about many things: the danger that can hide behind familiar faces, the power of forensic science to deliver justice even across decades, the endurance of families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten, and the importance of preserving evidence because what seems unsolvable today may yield to tomorrow's technology. It's about a young woman with a passion for protecting the ocean who trusted the wrong person and paid with her life. It's about a small fishing village that had to reckon with having a murderer in its midst for 17 years. It's about detectives who never closed the file, forensic scientists who kept improving their techniques, and a legal system that, however imperfectly and slowly, eventually delivered accountability. Most fundamentally, it's about the Whitmore family's refusal to accept that their daughter would become just another cold case statistic. Jennifer and David's advocacy, their persistence in staying connected to the investigation, their work to improve the system for other families, all of it mattered. Their pain had purpose. Their daughter's death, though it could never be redeemed, had not been meaningless. In the waters off Stonington, the kelp forests that Katie had studied continue to sway with the tide. Students still visit the monitoring stations she established, still collect data on water temperature and species diversity, still contribute to the body of scientific knowledge about climate change and coastal ecosystems. Her work continues, carried forward by others, a living legacy that no murderer could erase. Tom Whitaker remains in Maine State Prison, where he will almost certainly die. He's now in his mid-60s, his health declining, his days measured in the institutional rhythms of prison life. He gave occasional interviews in the early years of his incarceration, but as public interest waned, so did media access. He exists now in the obscurity that's perhaps the most fitting punishment, forgotten by the community that once knew him, remembered only as the man who killed Katie Whitmore and then pretended innocence for 17 years. The last word belongs to Katie herself, or rather to the words she left behind. In her research notebook, found among her belongings after her death, she'd written an entry dated July 10, 2005, just 5 days before she was killed. The kelp forests are remarkable ecosystems, resilient yet vulnerable, ancient yet constantly renewing. They teach us that life persists, that even in cold, dark water, beauty and complexity thrive. I hope my work helps protect these places for future generations who'll stand on these shores and look out at the water, wondering what lives beneath the surface. The ocean keeps its secrets, but science and patience can reveal them. That's what gives me hope. Katie believed in the power of patience and science to reveal hidden truths. She couldn't have known that those same principles would, 17 years after her death, reveal the truth about what happened to her on that July day in 2005. But perhaps there's a kind of poetry in it. The same careful, methodical approach she brought to studying kelp forests ultimately brought her justice. If you found this story meaningful, if you believe that every cold case deserves another look and every victim's family deserves answers, please subscribe to stay informed about these cases. They matter. The victims matter. Science matters. Persistence matters. And sometimes, justice comes late but still arrives. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next video, where we continue to shine light on cases hidden in the shadows.